two things that you can do that would prove that you can't do a sedentary occupation. Number one, undergo a functional capacity evaluation. That's an objective measure of your ability to sit, stand, walk, stoop, bend, lift, and engage in repetitive activities. What's crucial here is that your FCE provider understand the definition of disability and understand where you're at. Are we at an own occupation stage or in any occupation stage? Because they want to be measuring, if you're at the own occupation stage, your abilities to perform the physical duties of your own occupation as it's defined in your disability policy. So many times I'll ask my FCE provider to simulate the different kinds of work activity that my client would be doing as part of performing their occupation. Now, if the policy defines occupation as performed by the employer, then obviously I want more specific information from my client to the VE about how their occupational duties are performed. If it's the generic performed in the national economy or pursuant to the DOT, I always supply my FCE provider with that documentation so they understand what the accepted occupational duties are so that when the FCE is performed, that can be objectively tested. Now, the second thing you can do, particularly if you have an MECF case or any case involving fatigue issues, endurance issues, is to undergo what's called a CPET examination. A CPET examination is a cardiac pulmonary exercise test, and it can be used to document not only the physical impairment in terms of fatigue, but the cognitive impairment that can come as a result of the fatigue. Now, there are two kinds. There's a one-day CPET, there's a two-day CPET. Each has advantages and disadvantages, and each, unfortunately, can be hard to obtain. A one-day CPET test can be done by a cardiologist or an exercise physiologist. I'm really leery about having a cardiologist do this because they don't get what the purpose of this test is as it relates to a disability. So I would prefer that you either have an exercise physiologist or a company that actually specializes in performing CPET tests. Now, unfortunately, a one-day CPET test doesn't always address the common issues in an MECFS case. And that's typically fatigue or the post-exertional malaise issues. That's why I think you're unfortunately better off to get the more expensive two-day CPET. There are places in New York, Washington State, California, and even Florida who do this testing. And if you don't live in those states, that obviously adds up in terms of the expenses. If you have a chance, as I said, I would like to see you have a two-day CPET test, because if you don't pass the first day, they probably aren't going to recommend that you do the second day. And if you pass the first day, then the second day's testing is going to document the fatigue and the cognitive issues. The import here is that a CPET can objectively document not only the physical functional findings you have, but can document the cognitive issues that you have performing the material and substantial duties of your own occupation or any occupation. Now, I also want you to remember that if you have an MECFS type situation or any other situation where you're getting this CPET test or you're having a functional capacity evaluation, we want the doctor to sign off on these results. Now, don't be surprised if the disability carrier asks for the raw data so that their liar for hire doctors can review and comment on the results. But I want you to understand that I think having your doctor sign off on this can be helpful. I have never seen a written judicial opinion rejecting the results of a CPET test, as they seem to be recognized by the court as the gold standard for testing. I have, however, seen courts reject functional capacity evaluations when the functional evaluation is inconsistent with reported activity, either on an activity of daily living form, statements made to doctors, or statements made to the disability carrier. Obviously, you have the burden to prove that you can't do even sedentary work. That means that you can only lift a maximum of 10 pounds at a time, that you can't sit more than 6 hours, you can only occasionally walk, and you can stand 2 hours in an 8-hour day. We want to make sure that ultimately the FCE or the CPET exam is addressing your ability to do sedentary work and explain why it is you're unable to do the material and substantial duties of your own occupation or any occupation. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't other ways that we can get about this and show that you can't do even sedentary work. There are non-exertional limitations. And if you have a sedentary residual functional capacity evaluation, but if you have to alternate sitting and standing, if you have to go to the restroom, if you have to take frequent breaks, your RFC, your residual functional capacity, is going to be eroded to less than sedentary. We want to make sure, of course, that those complaints are documented in your medical records and there's an objective basis of that. But we also want your doctor to address those non-exertional restrictions, limitations. Potentially, they could be also addressed in an FC if you've got to use the restroom frequently. But again, I think those non-exertional impairments need to be addressed by your physician. Got it? Those are the two ways that you can try to overcome sedentary restrictions and limitations and make it less than sedentary, making it more difficult for the carrier to prevail on a wrongful denial. Got it? Okay. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Winning Isn't Easy. If you enjoyed this episode, consider liking this page, leaving a review, or sharing it with your friends and family. Please subscribe to this podcast. That way you're going to get a notification every time a new episode drops. I hope you tune in next week for another insightful episode of Winning Isn't Easy. Thanks.